Greetings and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about naming our very first functional group. I know that we talked about naming alkanes and cycloalkanes already, but those aren't truly functional groups. They don't include anything besides just carbons and hydrogens with no double bonds. So alcohols, which if you recall are groups or any carbon chain with an OH attached, these are our first true functional group. So let's jump into how to name these guys. So let's go all the way back to our very simple name of alkane. You may recall that in order to designate how long the carbon chain is, you replace alk with eth or meth or prop or whatever. But when we are indicating that our main chain is an alcohol, or has an OH attached, what we do is we drop this E and replace it with all, just like alcohol. So the way to name an alcohol is to simply replace that E at the very end of the word with all. And this will be very common for our functional groups, is to replace that E at the very end with something. And in this case, that something is all. So let's do our first little example. We will draw a 4-carbon chain with an OH coming off of it. So going back to our nomenclature, what we need to do is find the longest carbon chain with our alcohol attached. If you have a functional group, which we now do for the first time, the main chain must include your highest priority functional group. So I'm going to write this down. The main chain, and this is in terms of nomenclature, must include the highest priority. And we'll get into priority as we add more functional group, but this is the only one we have right now. Functional group. All right, so our main chain does include that alcohol. The main chain will always simply be the carbon chain, but notice that the alcohol is attached to it. So I would number this as 4 carbons from left to right. We would go left to right because the alcohol is closest to the left side. Essentially, once we have a functional group, it trumps everything else. So it wouldn't matter where the other substituents are. It's the main highest priority functional group that rules everything. So your main chain has to include it. The numbering is always impacted by where that alcohol is, not anything else. And so this would be a butane is the name of a 4-carbon chain. But again, what we're doing is we're striking that E from the end and replacing it with all. So this would be butanol. We need to indicate where the alcohol is, and the alcohol is coming off of carbon number 2. So we could either call this 2-butanol or butan 2-all. So this is the first time where we can actually inject a letter into the middle of a word, a number into the middle of a word. It gets important later on if you have multiple functional groups, but either way is perfectly fine. Butan 2-all is correct, 2-butanol is also correct. And that is how we name these. So we can add in substituents, we can go back to what we've done and add those things in, but essentially those are the only rules that change when we're adding in the layer of how do we name an alcohol. So I'm going to give you a simple example and then we'll jump into something a little bit more complicated. All right, I hope I didn't scare you by saying something more complicated. It's the same rules, I just want to give you some examples that I don't want to trick you down the line. All right, so let's do this as our main chain, or as our test molecule for the moment. So the longest carbon chain in this molecule would actually be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If you veered downwards, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you would have a shorter main chain. But remember that the main chain always has to be attached to the highest priority functional group. So therefore, this carbon right here, the one attached to the alcohol, needs to be in the main chain, regardless of anything else. So we need to use this carbon. Therefore, our main chain can't just be that left to right part. So the longest carbon chain that includes this one would be up and to the left. So the main chain in this example would actually be this molecule right here, or that chain right there. So this would include 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons, but most importantly, the alcohol is attached to it. All right, and when we number this, again, this is step number 2 of the same naming we've been doing, the alcohol has to be closest to carbon number 1. Well, in this case, the alcohol is on carbon number 1. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The main chain in this case would be called a 1-hexanol. So a 6-carbon chain is hexane. We drop the E and replace it with all, and we need to include a number that tells us where that alcohol is. So it could be 1-hexanol or hexan-1-all. Either one is perfectly fine. We do have a substituent in this case, so notice that we have this chunk coming off of carbon number 2. This would be a 2-propyl, because that's just 3 carbons in a straight row. And so right before 1-hexanol or hexan-1-all, we would have 2-propyl. So either 2-propyl 1-hexanol or 2-propyl hexan-1-all. You could have, of course, a molecule that has both an alcohol and another substituent, and that doesn't change anything. So let's do this guy right here. All right, once again, we are going to find our main chain, but our main chain needs to have the alcohol included, so it doesn't matter how long this is. Here, I'll make this comically long. The longest chain would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Again, we can't cross this little line right here. Our main chain either needs to be the carbons in a row or the carbons in a ring. So, because the alcohol is attached to these, even though that's less carbons, this 5-carbon chain with the alcohol coming directly off of it needs to be our main chain. So our main chain is those 5 carbons. I'll start numbering at 1 right here. Notice that I get to that other chunk if I go clockwise faster. So if I go 1, 2, 3, it's coming off of number 3. If I went the other way, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4. We want to have the numbers as low as possible. So our main chain here would be 1-cyclo pent and nol. So again, I started with alkane. This part right here became pent. This part right here became all, and the ane is still there. And then I added cyclo to the front. So cyclopentanol is the name of that guy. The alcohol is coming off of carbon number 1. You can choose to not include that 1 when we're doing a cyclo, because of course the alcohol is coming off of number 1, it has to. But we do need to include the location and the name of this substituent. So this is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 carbon substituent. So this guy would be called a heptol. So therefore we have a 3-heptyl 1-cyclopentanol. All right, that's it. Please bring any questions you have to class, and in order to have good questions, I need you to practice this. I will see you soon.